Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to this session on reducing global methane emissions. We're glad to have you with us. I'm Rob Stavins. I'm a faculty member at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel with a really stellar group of experts in alphabetical order. Mark Brownstein, Senior Vice President for Energy Transition at the Environmental Defense Fund. Jody Freeman, Archibald Cox Professor of Law and Director of the Environmental and Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School. Adam Pacsi, Methane Policy Advisor at Chevron. And Steve Wofsy, the A.L. Roth Professor of Atmospheric and Environmental Science at the Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Science. So why have we assembled this group, and indeed why are we holding this session focusing on reducing methane emissions, since of course so much of the talk at Climate Week is about CO2, about carbon dioxide. The reason is that methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. It has very high global warming potential, albeit a relatively short atmospheric lifetime compared with CO2. So although the quantities of methane going into the atmosphere are much less than the quantities of CO2 going into the atmosphere from anthropogenic sources, methane emissions abatement can be exceptionally valuable, particularly in the short term, because methane emissions abatement can reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere and therefore induce climate change, particularly over, again, the short term. And that can be of great value in order to give the world time to bend the curve, as it were, on CO2 emissions, to conduct more research on carbon mitigation and removal, and ultimately to implement long-term effective strategies to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So we're looking at methane emissions, I want to emphasize, not as a substitute for reducing CO2 emissions, but as a complement to reducing CO2 emissions. So this session is complementary to everything you're hearing in the other sessions over the week. As we'll soon hear from our panelists, meaningful methane emissions reductions can be achieved through multiple channels, including government policies, private sector actions, research, and effective engagement with key stakeholders. I'm pleased to say, and I certainly want to point out to you, that here at Harvard we have launched a major university-wide initiative as part of the Salata Institute, and it's on reducing global methane emissions. And it brings together more than 20 faculty members, senior faculty members from across the university, 4 departments in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, 5 professional schools, as well as a number of key external collaborators, including, I should mention, the Environmental Defense Fund. In the initiative's first year, we have 10 individual specific research and outreach projects. And in our second year, which will begin on July 1st, we're going to have an even greater number of projects going forward. Importantly, each one of these projects seeks to not only carry out scientific research, whether it's the natural sciences, the social sciences, or indeed the humanities, but also to translate science into action. And that phrase of translating science into action could also be a way to describe the theme of the session that we're now going to begin as I turn to our panelists. So first, to Mark, methane emissions come from diverse sources around the world, different sectors. Can you start us off by describing to us what's the relative importance some kind of ranking perhaps of the different sources, whether it's by sectors, geographically, and you could describe it globally, or if there's specific, like important countries you want to focus on. Tell us about those.
Sure. So let's just start with some basic numbers. So methane emissions from human activities. It's a relatively defined category of sources. Roughly a third comes from fossil fuel production and use. The majority of that associated with oil and gas, although there definitely is methane emissions associated with coal in places like, particularly in China. That's a big issue. So about a third from fossil fuels. About 40% or so comes from agriculture. But that needs to be broken down a little bit because actually the lion's share of agricultural emissions come from livestock. Inevitably, when you talk about methane, you start getting into cow fart jokes, right? But actually, it's the burps from livestock that are the primary source of methane emissions, right? Ruminants. The other, about 10% within agriculture is from rice farming. The decay of biological material in the fields as they're flooded, and then burning of biomass. So that's your 40%. Then landfills, right? Garbage dumps are probably about another 10 or 11%. And that's it. That's what we're dealing with. At Environmental Defense Fund, we tend to focus a lot of our effort on the fossil fuel section, in particular oil and gas, because amongst all of those key sources, the oil and gas industry actually is a reasonably homogeneous group of actors. I say reasonably, we can talk more about that later. And the strategies for reducing methane pollution or eliminating it in the oil and gas industry are very well understood. And in some cases actually have a net payback. Methane is what we know as natural gas. Every molecule of methane that goes into the atmosphere is one less molecule of energy that could be put to productive use. So in many respects, when the oil and gas industry takes steps to reduce methane pollution, it's really an opportunity to capture energy resource. And so there is some economic value in doing it. So for all those reasons, a well understood, a reasonably homogeneous industry, a relatively well-defined and well-understood set of control strategies, and some measure of payback are all the reasons why we tend to focus on that first third as being the biggest priority.
Great, thank you, Mark. That's a great foundation and a great sort of setting the stage to move forward. And I want to alert all of you before we continue that we're going to try to reserve a good portion of our time for Q&A with all of you. So, but first I'm going to go through the entire panel. We may have a little bit of discussion, but we'll have, something between 20 minutes and a half hour for discussion with all of you for your questions and comments. So if you think of things as you're going along, jot them down or inscribe them in the mind, and we will get to you after not very long. So next, let me turn to Steve Wofsy. Steve, a huge challenge, particularly when I think about 10 years ago when people were talking about methane emissions and climate change. A big challenge of addressing methane emissions has been the tremendous uncertainty regarding the specific locations and, for that matter, the magnitudes of the emissions. But you've been at the forefront in work you've been doing at Harvard of some remarkable new tools for measurement of methane emissions at specific points in time, using aerial and satellite detection. Can you sort of fill us in on that?
Okay, so the first question I'd like to pose is, well, what do we actually need to know, and why do we need to know it? So what we would like to know is where the emissions are originating, how much is being emitted there, and also for particular sources that we see out there, how long are they on? Because one of the things that we find when we actually do make these measurements is that you wind up with a very large number of sources that are emitting a lot of methane, very high rates for short periods of time. And so then the next question you immediately ask is, well, okay, why are they doing that? What is happening there? Is that, are these all upsets? Are they operational? Are they design features? Then in addition to those large sources, you also have kind of a mist or a high emission rate that's very diffuse and spread out along the landscape. And that represents innumerable small sources, equipment that was designed to vent methane, equipment that's leaking, et cetera, et cetera. So when you start thinking about making measurements to figure out where these emissions are coming from and why they're happening, you're doing that to figure out how you can start to eliminate them. If you don't know why they're happening, you don't know where they are, you can't do that. So in the days before we started the methane satellite that I'll tell you just a little bit about, the Environmental Defense Fund ran a bunch of programs to make measurements using ground-based and small aircraft type measurements to figure out whether the amounts of methane that would be released from the oil and gas industry were anywhere near close to what was being reported. And they found that the number was about 3 times as much, or 2.5, something like that, was actually being emitted. So now the next question is why? And the following question after that is, well, that's great for the United States. What about the rest of the world? So that's why we use satellites. We use satellites to try to understand what the emissions are, why they're happening, and where they're happening all over the world. And there's kind of several different ways that you can go about doing that. We have at least one satellite that measures globally every day. Well, it doesn't measure everywhere because there are clouds and whatnot. And of course, when you're going to measure that large an area that quickly, you're going to have a very large spatial resolution. You're not going to be able to see little things. Then there's other types of satellites that can see the little things, but they can't see the big picture. They can only see the little things. And then there's the methane satellite, for which I'm the lead scientist. It's funded by Environmental Defense Fund. There's a subsidiary of EDF called methanesat.org that runs the satellite. And the goal of that satellite is to go in between those two scales, to be able to measure a very fine scale, not as fine as the little guys who are looking at individual sources, and also look at the area that get very high precision. Taking those 3 together, you can then get a picture of where the methane is being emitted over the world, begin to understand what the underlying processes are, and begin to take it apart. And then the next problem, of course, is what do you do with those data? And I think some other people on the panel may be discussing that. We can also come back to that later. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks. Well, let's turn exactly to that, because with these better measurements, the reason for the measurements is to be able to do something with them. And that brings us to the work of Adam at Chevron and beyond Chevron. Can you say something about the methods of control? We can focus on the oil and gas sector. What are the principal methods of control? And if you could say something about the costs of abatement, that would also be exceptionally valuable. And I'd also invite you, while you're doing that, if you want to go beyond Chevron and talk about OGCI, some of these industry consortia that have been so active lately.
Sure. First off, I'd like to thank Harvard for hosting this panel. Super interesting. I think it's going to be a nice discussion over the next 45 minutes or so. Methane management is a really important piece of reducing the carbon intensity of our operations. And when we're trying to operationalize the types of things that Mark and Steve are talking about up here, we really think about these in 3 buckets of actions. One is on facility design. That's putting in equipment to actually capture the methane gas in the field and use it for something productive, be it sales, on-site energy use, those sorts of things. And there's a variety of different known technologies for doing that, and there's a list of sources that a lot of different documents can point you to there. The second is operating practices. It's actually how you manage a site from day to day with a methane minimization mindset. These can run the gamut from things that are quite low tech in terms of the right staffing of operators during certain procedures happening, to some more high tech sort of data driven solutions that we've also put out there that are ways of preventing emissions. So a wide swath of approaches there. The third is using advanced technology, and I think that's been the area that's been the most interesting from a technology development standpoint. When I think back 5 years ago or so about the options that we had for trying to detect and measure emissions, it was really a lot of handheld technologies, very manual, very labor intensive, operators going around from valve to valve and site to site looking for emissions. What's really happened over the last 5 years is some concerted technology development to get better tools, both by industry and sort of groups like the Department of Energy through funding. So at Chevron, we've tested more than 14 of these over the last, since 2016, to try to really understand what can scale and work operationally across a global asset base. And that's really been the area it's advanced. So these are things like satellite technologies or some really interesting advances in aircraft technology, particularly in the US, that allow for methane management at scale, which is really, when you think about an industry operationalizing technology, that's really the goal. Industries, I think, played an important role both in terms of sort of setting up these sorts of things that we're doing from our own operations, but we also think it's important to partner more broadly than just our own operations. So I'll kind of highlight two briefly. We can go into some more depth on either of those if there's interest, but one's the Environmental Partnership, which is about 100 companies in the US onshore, everything from some of your larger major players to some of your smaller operators that have a consistent set of best practices and some really nice regional workshops for talking about what's worked sort of closer to the wellhead, in particular production basins. So that's been a really effective partnership, I think, to learn and to share what's valuable. The second I'll touch on briefly is the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, where Chevron and a number of the other larger oil and gas operators globally are members. There was an interesting case study last year in Iraq where the OGCI helped deploy technology, satellite-based technology, with 6 smaller operators in that region. Hard place to operate, hard place to do methane detection, but followed up with operators after there were detections to understand what mitigation options were possible. And it was successful enough in terms of mitigation that's been expanded to include Egypt, Algeria, and Kazakhstan in future iterations. So I think it's really a good way of taking what we know, what's worked, and to expanding it abroad to some other companies in some different circumstances. Thanks.
Well, thanks. So there's certainly a role for initiatives by private industry, and we'll follow up on those. But for a problem that is essentially an externality, there is indeed a justification for government policies to become involved. If we were in a lot of the other sessions in Climate Week and people were talking about comparing US policy to policies in other parts of the world, the US wouldn't necessarily come off very well. But an exception to that, in my mind, is methane. Because actually on methane, there are very serious policies and regulations, the Inflation Reduction Act, other regulations, as well as the US leadership with Europe on establishing the Global Methane Pledge. You've been involved in all of that and think about that deeply, Jody. I'd love you to comment on, the relative importance of these different policies. And also, I'm sure people are curious, and if I don't ask you, they will. What's going to survive the November election if the Republican candidate is elected?
The idea that you think I know the answer to that is really great. I just want to correct something. I would love to be on the faculty of the Kennedy School of Government, but in fact, I'm at Harvard Law School, and I just want to shout out to my whole team, which came, the Harvard Law School Environmental Energy Law Program and the director of our fabulous Environmental Law Clinic. I mean, we have a great turnout. So if you have any questions following up on anything we say, they know all the answers. Here's what I want you to feel right now. I think you should feel really happy and in a good mood because you're in the one session that has a good news story about climate change. This is methane, the technology, the scientific advances, technology advances you've heard about, the relative industry buy-in that you're hearing about, and the government policy that Rob just mentioned are all aligned at the moment. And we have had over the last few years, a kind of global methane moment of real relative success and promise. And this alignment is new-ish. And so what you're seeing is the satellite and other remote sensing, drones, methods of monitoring that didn't exist before. So now you can have comprehensive monitoring. I think we're on our way to continuous emissions monitoring. You've got the ability to detect these giant plumes that we never could detect before that are venting vast amounts of methane into the atmosphere with really terrible consequences. And you can address this. You can actually make progress. So you can feel like you're actually able to control this and make a contribution to improving or slowing climate change. So there's real promise here. And I would say there are more regulatory frameworks being put in place domestically here in the US. We have the first ever federal rules that will regulate existing sources of methane. That's the older sources in the oil and gas sector. Not new sources, but existing sources, which is where all the benefit comes from getting at old leaky equipment, pneumatics, valves, and other things that Adam knows much more about. But if that rule, which the Biden administration finalized and is now being challenged, and there's a stay petition pending to get the Supreme Court to stay it from ever being implemented. That's happening right now. But if this rule is implemented, it will be very meaningful. It will require much more frequent monitoring of methane leaks. It will require, once they're detected, for them to be addressed, that is, repaired. There is a provision in it that I want to credit my team with helping to put in place, which allows the rule to adapt to and include new technologies as they evolve. And Mark knows a lot about this. He worked on this too. So that you don't have a static rule. You have a rule that says to industry, if you can develop new ways of detecting this, we'll accommodate that. We'll let you use them as long as they're as long as they're reliable. And it has a super emitter program built into it for the first time, which is really exciting, which allows the EPA to rely on qualified, certified third parties in the private sector to detect methane, come to the agency and say, hey, we think we've got something here. Let the agency verify it. Let the company decide whether it can demonstrate it's not theirs. If it's theirs, they're responsible for it. They have to address it. So these are all regulatory innovations that are really good, and they've been put in place in the US. And then we also see other countries doing the same. We also see importers of natural gas. So we're a big producer and exporter of natural gas, right? But there are countries, the EU, of course, big net importer. They're also putting screening tools in place so that they can, so that their rules will require companies to report their methane emissions. And so they can get at the relative methane intensity of their imports. And so that's another source of pressure. So the demand side, the supply side, these regulatory frameworks being put in place are really, really helpful. You also have industry initiatives that I think are meaningful. Maybe we can talk more about that in questions. I think the Global Methane Pledge you mentioned, which is the product of one of the Conference of the Party meetings. You know, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992 set up a regime of meetings, regular meetings of the Conference of the Parties. Those are the big climate palooza events you see around the world. The Glasgow meeting, which was the first meeting of the Biden administration that they attended. And of course, we rejoined the Paris Agreement right after President Biden won the presidency. At that meeting, they announced the Global Methane Pledge, which is a pledge to reduce emissions globally by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. And you've got, I think it's over 150 countries agreeing to that pledge. That's a very significant commitment for countries to make. And then the most recent Conference of the Parties in Dubai, very controversial meeting, because of course it was in a Gulf producer state, but it resulted in the first ever pledge of national oil companies, along with some of the publicly traded companies, the big majors, of which Chevron is one, to agree to a program, a commitment on methane, to getting to net zero by 2050, getting to net zero flaring sooner than that, and a variety of other commitments. And a lot of people scoff at this and say, well, you can't trust industry. But these commitments could be extremely meaningful because the industry itself produces a huge amount of methane and a very significant share. And I'm not talking about their energy production in terms of the use of it. I'm talking about in the production of oil and gas, so their own Scope 1 emissions. And so I just brought my numbers here. The oil and gas industry is responsible for 5 billion tons of CO2. That's 10% of the world total, and half of that is methane. And so if you can wrap your arms around just what the industry is producing to produce energy, you'll all correct me if I'm wrong, that would be a very significant gain, a significant improvement, a real climate policy. So if you put together industry initiatives with the regulatory initiatives and with the science and technology, you have something really significant. The last thing I'll mention in the US that matters is in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is Congress's big climate policy by a name that nobody will ever associate with climate, but it's loaded up with climate incentives, tax credits, subsidies. Included there, the only regulatory measure in the whole thing that really is meant to reduce emissions is the methane waste charge. It's a fee, basically. It's a tax on methane. If companies produce over a certain threshold of methane, this is oil and gas companies, if they produce over a certain threshold of methane, they have to pay a fee that is phased in from something like, my team's going to yell at me, $900 a ton to $1,500 a ton. It phases in over time. But they don't have to pay it, says Congress in the Inflation Reduction Act, if they are in compliance with the EPA regs on methane, which have been implemented by the states. If the states have implemented their plans to meet those standards and the companies are in compliance, they don't have to pay the methane fee. So there's an incentive built into the Inflation Reduction Act for the states to get their plans in place, for the companies not to obstruct that so that they will be free of paying this fee. So you've got a lot of policy working together, going in the right direction, and that is why you're in the right room at the right time.
That's a great way to wrap up the first round. You know, I mentioned at the beginning that at Harvard we have a university-wide initiative on reducing global methane emissions. I have the joy of actually directing that. And although it's mainly about academic research, it's mainly work that's going on at Harvard, we're also tied in very much with NGOs, such as the Environmental Defense Fund, with the key companies around the world, such as Chevron. And in fact, every member of this panel is associated one way or another with this Harvard-wide initiative, which is fantastic. We're at the end of the first of what will be 3 years minimum. I have a very brief question for each of you as follow-up that I noted down while you were speaking. And because of time, I'm going to ask you to just offer brief responses if you could. And I'm going to go, I took them in order as you were speaking. Mark, you commented something that struck me. You said, ONG sources are not very homogeneous. Tell us about the heterogeneity.
Well, they are, I mean, oil and gas is reasonably homogeneous, but people often make the mistake of thinking that the oil and gas industry is Chevron, is Exxon. Truth of the matter is these large publicly traded companies are responsible for roughly 25% of global production. Fully half of global production is in the hands of national oil companies. You think about Saudi Aramco or Petrobras in Brazil. And those companies, 50% of production, 2/3 of known oil and gas reserves are in the hands of these national oil companies. And so it can't be understated just how important it is for our work that we find ways to engage national oil companies in this conversation, because even if Chevron were to do everything that we know they could and should be doing, right, it's not enough. It leaves a lot of pollution on the table. National oil companies, as you can imagine, right, it is about the bottom line. They are profit-oriented entities, but they have really a social and economic development mission that they are also responsible to their governments for. And so their motivations in producing oil and gas, their motivations in terms of whether and how they'll reduce methane emissions are slightly different than what you would find in talking to a large oil and gas company like Chevron. And then in the United States, 75% of our oil and gas is produced by small companies. You know, think Jed Clampett and the Beverly Hillbillies. I mean, we have some of those small mom and pop operators. They have a different incentive structure entirely. And so understanding these little...
Private equity.
And private equity. So understanding the motivation of these subcultures within the oil and gas industry is very important to getting at this issue.
Yeah, I mean, as Jody could surely verify, the history of environmental regulation in the United States is that the small providers of whatever the particular sector is are often more difficult to regulate, the mom and pop operations, than the major companies. That's our history.
And that's 75% of U.S. oil and gas production.
So I want to go on to Steve, because what you really featured, Steve, in your interesting comments was the way in which methane sat is forming a bridge between aerial detection and tropomi. Is that right? And I'm not sure that everyone got that, and it's a key point. So in simple terms and briefly, can you hammer that home?
Yeah, so tropomi is a globally sensing satellite. excuse me, and it can tell you about how much is being emitted from areas that are emitting at a high rate over a large area, meaning part of a continent, and over a long period of time. They have to average quite a lot of data to do it. MethaneSat looks at smaller areas, still pretty big, a few hundred kilometers on the side, and each time it looks, it has very, very high fidelity, very high resolution. Not quite as high as those guys that look at the little sources, but those can only look at the little sources and not at the big picture. So what we're trying to do is to knit together the point sources and the area sources and be able to do it in such a way that we can compare one basin to another. And what we find, not too surprisingly, is that depending on where you're looking, you get very different emission rates. Well, why is that? So to Jody's point, if we have a regulatory framework, we want to know where those are. We want to go hunting where the ducks are. So that's what MethaneSat is designed to do. And the idea is to feed all of this information into essentially aggregating organizations. So IMEO, the International Methane Emissions Observatory, is a UN agency that's supposed to be a clearinghouse for all this stuff. And it really brings daylight to the problem. Like, where is it happening? Why is it happening? How much? And that should be a tool that in the toolbox to bring them down.
Thanks, that's very helpful. You know, Adam, when there is abatement of methane in the oil and gas sector, repairing a leak in a pipeline or a pump at a wellhead, we're essentially, or you're essentially, keeping more of a merchantable product in the pipeline, i.e. natural gas that can be sold and earn revenue for the company. So does this mean that this is one of those win-win strategies that are frequently talked about, but I'm not sure I've ever observed over 30 years of working on environment? In other words, are there actually negative costs, or are there some other costs that are engaged in carrying out that abatement?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I maybe have a little bit of a different perspective than Mark on the homogeneity versus heterogeneity. I think there actually are quite a few different sources, and if you start thinking globally, it's probably not as homogeneous as we think it is. So there's a lot of different individual actions you'd have to take. Each have their own abatement cost in different parts of the world. So it's a global company. There is some variation in those costs, but I think the really interesting area where there has been advancements is really on the technology side in terms of helping operators like us find emissions, particularly in the US, where the technology ecosystems find things much more efficiently. If you take, for example, just to maybe go back to an academic paper, I think when Mark's group did their synthesis study in 2018, it was something like 300 production sites that were wrapped up into that entire piece. There was just a paper published in Nature a couple of months ago that was 1 million observations. So you're talking about vast quantities of scale you can get to in terms of observations that didn't really exist before. And I think that's really the key piece to really understanding the puzzle is having that kind of scalability and potential.
So it's interesting because what you're highlighting is that a cost which wouldn't be included in the technical cost of patching or putting a different pump in place is the search cost of finding the methane emissions. But in fact, what is happening, if I understand it, as a result of the satellite technology, that those search costs are coming down over time, and that's going to lower the total abatement cost.
And there's not a single silver bullet technology. I want to be clear about that. There's a nice role for satellite. There's a nice role for aircraft. There's a nice role for a lot of different things, particularly if you start talking about the regulatory structure in the United States that Jody mentioned. Some of the satellites probably are a little bit too high on the detection limit side for what we'd be allowed to use. But there's been a lot of really good advancements, particularly in the US on aircraft is what we've talked a lot about.
So Jody, you've emphasized at the beginning and at the end of your comments that this is the good news session. And that's delightful. So my question is there good news for the other sessions from this session? In other words,
you don't need to be in the geoengineering session.
Yeah.
That was Mark's point earlier, that you should be here because you don't need to be there if we succeed.
So what I'm asking is whether or not there are lessons to be learned from methane emissions abatement policies for CO2 emissions abatement policies, or is the reason why it's just such good news in case of methane is something very specific about methane that doesn't apply to, the
So yes,
CO2 issue?
so yes and no. I'll try to be
Okay.
really brief, and then if people have follow-ups, that's fine. The part that's unique about methane, from what I understand, is because it's odorless and invisible, we don't know where it is, and so we have a need for all of this detection technology, and that's been the problem. And once you figure out where it is, then you can figure out how to repair it, et cetera, and it becomes a cost question. And so methane is unique in that way. It's also unique in the sense that it's the product of the industry, as Mark pointed out. They ought not want to lose it. So their incentive ought to be to control it. Sometimes they want to lose it because they're getting at the oil, not the gas. But for the most part, it's beneficial to keep most of it. The other thing is, I think the industry has a special incentive in this one domain to want to collaborate, and maybe Adam can agree or disagree with this, but it's now table stakes for the oil and gas industry to say, we're going to take care of our own methane leaks that we control. We're not going to talk to you about our product necessarily that other people burn, but we're going to control our own methane because we're trying to make the argument that natural gas is a bridge fuel to the future. So we have to do something positive about controlling our own emissions. So they can't really do the one without and be plausible and believable without the other. So that's why it's unique. But the lesson is you can sometimes get alignment with government policy, with at least some of industry, if not all of industry, that wants to row in your direction. I think this is true of the power sector, for example, that's getting increasingly greener with more renewables, et cetera, and government policy that supports that. And when you can get this confluence of events and technologies that go along with you. So you get a drop in the price for renewable technologies at the same time. And when all of this happens together, you're going in the right direction. And the auto sector is different again. There's real potential in the auto sector for alignment, right? So you have policy there, you have technology there, and you have an industry ready to go, ready to shift because it needs to produce EVs for a global transition. So in each sector, I can tell you a good news story. The oil and gas sector has always been the hardest in terms of what to do about the product. That's a different conversation, right? That's the hardest conversation.
Thank you for that. So now we have time for your questions. We have a couple of people who are going to have microphones. We'll be in either side of the room. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and I'll try to go back and forth so it's not always one part of the room. And our first question is right over here. And let me say that as you're asking your question, tell us your name and your institution, where you work. That would be of interest. And I'd ask you to keep questions brief, just to be fair to others who are with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Tomaso. I'm a researcher at the Harvard School of Public Health of Environmental Health. So, Mark, when you gave this very nice, comprehensive overview of the sources of methane, we also have another area of storage, which is permafrost and terrestrial permafrost and subsea permafrost. And that wasn't one of the ones currently that we would consider a source, but with obviously global warming, that's become very spatially diffused into the future and will be converted from storage point to a source point. So my question is, are any of these methods of detection applicable to something as spatially diffused rather than a leak at the pump or manufacturing process? And how big of a problem will that be going into the future?
Well,
thank you.
I'll let Steve answer the measurement question, but I want to pick up on what part of the reason why I focus on the anthropogenic sources, right, the human caused sources, is precisely because methane accelerates warming. And of course, warming is what melts permafrost. So if you want to avoid methane emissions from permafrost, you want to slow methane emissions from the sources that you can control. So it's not that permafrost doesn't matter, it's that the strategy to deal with methane from permafrost is the anthropogenic, methane. Over to Steve.
Steve, can you say something about the detection for this very diffuse source?
Yeah, I think both working at the scale of methane sat and the tropomi scale, we should be able to detect changes and potentially increases in permafrost emissions coming from permafrost or clathrate ablation and whatnot. I can tell you that there is sort of a misunderstanding about this because the methane that's produced in permafrost is produced fairly far below the surface, and the surface is very, very efficient. The organisms in the surface layers are very efficient in removing methane. So it's actually not yet been observed that significant increases have observed in the permafrost. That's not to say it won't happen in the future. For example, if you collapse the permafrost, then all bets are off, then you can completely change the structure. But the short answer is we can observe it and we will observe it. It's not the primary goal of MethaneSat per se. We will be looking, and so will other satellites coming that will use similar technology. So it's recognized as an important question.
Thanks. I think I saw a hand before over here. There.
These are all plants.
Oh, wait,
from
is
the-
this, are you a ringer
I'm
from the
not
law
planted.
school?
I'm not planted.
Oh, yeah.
Those are
No.
behind.
No.
No.
My name is Bethany Davis Knoll. I work at NYU Law School. The Harvard people they didn't have anything to do with this question. But I'm happy to be here. This is such a great conference, and it's really an interesting topic. Okay, so I want to ask about infrastructure. So I'm curious about that. I know EDF does a lot of work on this, and in particular, the infrastructure and the leaking wells and the methane from that. So, and I want to ask you what you think about this. So, from what I've read, there's at least some parts of the industry that have a tendency to pass down infrastructure to like a less solvent company, and then and also a tendency not to plug everything or not to buy the bonds that are big enough to plug all these wells because it's really expensive. And I'm wondering what you all think, actually, like industry, EDF, everybody up there. What's the best solution to that? And also, how big of a problem is that? How much are you worried about that? And I'm talking mostly about abandoned wells, like the ones where you can still trace to an owner, not the orphaned wells, because I know we've got the government's going to have to pay for those. So talking about before that happens, how you address that, because it's a really tricky and interesting problem, in my opinion. So thanks.
So before I turn to a member of the panel to answer their question, among the 10 projects, so you can go to the website of the Harvard Salata Methane Initiative, is in fact one which is focused on abandoned wellheads and dealing with them. And it's two professors from the government department together with Carrie Jenks, who's with us from Harvard Law School, are working on that together. The focus initially in the coming year is going to be on Pennsylvania. Would someone like, let's take one of you to
Well,
answer.
I'm going to turn that over to Adam. Adam, what do we
Okay,
do
Adam.
about what do we do about legacy assets?
Just FYI, Adam's a sustainability guy from Chevron, okay? So, Adam's a good guy.
Nonetheless.
Nonetheless, okay. So it is an area where terminology, I think, matters a little bit, and they can get very confusing at times with these terminologies. So you have abandoned wells, which is overall a quite broad term. It's actually reported. EPA makes an estimate every year as part of the greenhouse gas emission inventory. I think it's roughly 1% of the emissions it tracks at the U.S. scale. I think it's about 2% of the U.S. oil and gas industry, 2 to 3%, somewhere in that area. So that's kind of giving you toward the sense of your scale on that. In the U.S., that's kind of roughly there. That encompasses a large number of terms. That's both plugged wells, things that have been sort of properly abandoned over the long period of the industry. And I think that's generally the norm within the sector, is that at the end of life, these things do get welled, they get plugged, they get remediated, get returned to service. And then there are estimates for unplugged wells, things like the orphan well issue that you talked about. What I think is an interesting piece there is there has been also some of the policy actions we've been talking about here. There is, particularly on the orphan well issue, a number of different policies that have emerged. So there's funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law for states to go help reduce some of their orphan well logs. So I think that's a key piece. And within that, there's also funding for folks like the Department of Energy and Interior and some of those others to actually try to understand if there's better technologies for detection, better technologies for plugging, those sorts of things to help kind of spur technology development in that space. I think that's sort of important pieces there as well. So it is an area I think that's moving. It's just it's a little bit different policy actors and a little bit different sort of regulations than what Jody had mentioned earlier.
So I wanted to get a question from the center section. So if someone could take a microphone to the gentleman in the back.
I think that we got it, Bethany.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful and interesting panel. I'm Uday Khemka of the Nandanjit Khemka Foundation, which is the oldest foundation out of India to focus on climate change for the last 30 years. A lot of our methane is from agriculture. Could we speak about international cooperation on that just for a minute?
Sure.
And separately and distinctly, I was very struck by the NOC point you made, the 25%. I mean, we've got to get to those national oil companies. Is there a good initiative around that which makes it clear that they benefit net present value, they save hydrocarbons, they're good things to be done, and what could one do to support such a thing? Thanks.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I'll take them in reverse order. So one of the real accomplishments of COP28, the conference of the parties that concluded in December in the United Arab Emirates, was something called the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, which is an industry led effort where signatories have committed essentially a 90% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. The significant piece of that charter is that over half of the companies signing were national oil companies, which is the first time that national oil companies in any great number have committed themselves to methane. Now, in total, we're still only talking about 40% of global oil production that has signed this charter. So we've got more work to do. But the fact of, and now what we are doing is we are working to stand up technical support capacity so that national oil companies can tap the expertise that exists in places like environmental defense, Chevron, and also financing. Right? Because for many of these national oil companies, the financing for reducing methane emissions is in competition with, funding social development in these countries. And so we need to make sure that there's financing. So I just came back from Baku, from Azerbaijan, where we were talking about the steps that we can expect to see when the world gets together in Azerbaijan for COP29 in November. So stay tuned. Now, for agriculture, one of the other significant accomplishments during COP28 was the announcement of the, and I'm going to get this, I'm probably going to garble this a little bit, but it's a dairy association collaborative sponsored with Danone and a number of other major dairy producers around the world who have now committed to working together to reduce methane emissions in the dairy sector. So again, stay tuned.
You know, as Jody, you mentioned that yours says John F. Kennedy School of Government, which is where I am based. Mine does not say it. It just says Harvard University. Oh, I can be Jody Freeman for an afternoon? I've dreamt of this.
You should say Harvard Law School.
Yeah, I've dreamt.
I'm just energy transition. I don't even get an affiliation.
The gentleman right here with the microphone, please.
Hi, a pleasure and a wonderful panel. I'm Vikram Singh with the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI. We're proud to partner with many of you on the panel today. I don't quite share Jody's enthusiasm, and not to put you on the spot. I mean, I do remain hopeful that countries like the United States are rolling out the right frameworks, the DOE, MMRV. But, you know, for newly producing countries, I'm just coming back from Suriname, Guyana, Senegal, Uganda, Namibia. These countries, I mean, with the exception of perhaps Norway and maybe Qatar, really capture methane. I mean, these countries don't have the capacity, the tools, the technology to be able to, rise to the, what we're asking of them. And to some degree, there's a certain level of hypocrisy from the global north, particularly the EU, to say that we will go green or we will have these standards, but nonetheless, we want to import African gas. And so what do you say to that and to these newly producing countries that are, they're sitting, it's a resource curse, to use an industry term, right? They don't have the infrastructure, and yet they have these hydrocarbons that the world seems to want and not help them produce in the best possible way. So that's one of the things that we're trying to tackle in conjunction.
I think this is such a legitimate point. It's one of the hardest features, the endemic feature of the climate challenge, which is that you have a problem created largely by Western developed countries, the global north, that benefited from the production of greenhouse gases for 150, 200 years. And you have now the consequences of that disproportionately falling on the global south while they're being asked not to actually use their resources. And their attitude is, what? You did. And there's something deeply unfair in this picture, and the challenge of developing technology, then getting it deployed in the global south and helping these economies get access to energy. They need access to energy to develop. They're entitled to develop, but it has to be increasingly cleaner. How do you help finance that? How do you unleash trillions of dollars of capital into environments where the risk to capital is higher? Who's going to do that? The World Bank? The governments cannot pay for all this. They have to unleash private capital globally. So the challenge of shifting resources and taking the burden on is the challenge that the developed world faces. They've made weak commitments, in my view, through the framework of the Paris Agreement. They can't even deliver on those weak commitments. It's a real failure today. But to me, that casts no shade whatsoever on the leading countries and first NOCs being willing to make some commitments. It's the beginning, I think, of a trend, but it doesn't solve the problem, which is a perennial problem.
And if I may, let me just put a finer point on it. All right.
Briefly.
There's a finer point,
There's
Mark?
a finer point on it. Steve talked at some length about the technology and what it can do to help us find emissions. Okay. This is an accountability tool as well. Okay, I forget who said it before, right? This is very much a trust but verify sort of thing, and we're not naive about the industry and its motivation and its track record, right? The significance of having global methane data is so that as commitments are made, we have the ability to track progress over time. Now, hopefully this data is going to show that emissions are going to start going down in the next 5 or 6 years. It's a knowable, right? We will know as a practical matter.
Can I go to the next question?
Sure.
Because we have several people have their hands up.
Gal had her hand up a long time.
We'll be briefer.
So
We'll be
did someone
briefer.
over here. So I'm going to take you next. Take a microphone. And I'm going to ask you to make the questions very brief and the responses brief, because otherwise we're going to leave people who cannot ask.
Try to be quick. From the global to the almost local, at the state level, we are not really counting emissions properly. Our time horizon is 100 years. We do averages times miles, even though we have the actual data. I think Massachusetts, that's definitely in Massachusetts. I think it's a problem in many states. So I guess my question is, are there strategies that states can use without looking really bad by suddenly changing how they calculate emissions and suddenly looking like we're doing a really bad job on emissions and we're going backwards? Maybe kind of a trigger where all states collectively, once enough states commit to it, that we all do it and change our definition of how we account for methane, and then we can all do it accurately so that we can better manage our
Colorado.
climate goals. Colorado? Okay.
That's the
and then
answer.
also,
That's a
say
brief
more,
answer.
but I also want to say everyone else in the world calls it methane. How do you guys deal with that? How
They're
do we call it
British.
methane?
It's anglophilic.
They sound ridiculous with
That's
methane.
anglophilic
I'm
methane.
going to take the next question. Thank you for that. This young lady right over here.
Hi there, thank you all. My name's Yasmina. I'm from M2X Energy. We're a supplier of gas to methanol modular systems, taking stranded gas and turning it into low carbon methanol. We've talked a lot about oil and gas, not so much about the two other larger sources. Why are we not seeing more regulation incentivizing reduction of methane emissions from agriculture and waste? Do we see a world in which the methane penalty might be expanded?
It's harder.
Ag is the third rail in U.S. domestic policy.
It's harder. I mean, we started to get into a debate about the diversity within the oil and gas industry. I mean, when you think about animal husbandry around the planet, okay, so yes, we're going to get Danone. Yes, we're going to get Nestle. Yes, we're going to get, right, but that's 25% of animal husbandry in the world. Okay, the other 75% are literally, mom and pops all over the place. So it's much harder to do, but that doesn't mean that it can't be done. There are lots of innovations that are beginning to take place in the food that you feed the animals so that they are less gassy. And that is something that could scale up, right? But that's very much in development.
But don't you think from a political perspective too, Mark, that at least domestically in the US, ag is just very difficult politically, and it would be easier to create incentives for them to participate in a cap and trade system by making money selling their methane into the system?
Yes, and part of the reason why we've put so much time and effort into developing better data is because at the end of the day, if you're going to have an incentive-based system, whether it's on agriculture or landfills or the like,
yeah,
you need the better data in order to be able to have a quality incentive system.
I mean, the other way I would...
landfill regs are coming, by the way, in Biden too.
Once again, you're the voice of optimism, Jody. So as an economist, the way I'll phrase the fact that it's easier, more difficult, is that oil and gas sector is the low-hanging fruit, at least in the United States. So the abatement costs, truly measured, including the political factors, that's why it gets the attention it does. There's also the reality, which I think is true in environmental policy across a broad set of issues, pre-climate change, that agricultural emissions, water quality is a great example in the Clean Water Act, are much more difficult to regulate and more costly to regulate because they're small sources, dispersed sources, as opposed to concentrated sources from industrial emissions. I think we have time for one very brief question. You've had your hand up and you even have a microphone. Go for it.
Yeah, I will be brief. So my name is Weila Gong. I'm a postdoc research fellow at the Environment and Natural Resources program at the Kennedy School. So my question is, what is the driving force behind the Global Methane Reduction Initiative, moving from more of a self-organizing voluntary initiative to more of some of the key actionable policy areas appearing on the government agenda, including US and China. So these two countries, they are more in intensive competition, but find the methane emission reduction as one of the key areas can collaborate.
Good. So I think the question is, US and China were exceptionally important in terms of their cooperation during the Obama administration. We probably wouldn't have the Paris Agreement without that. Is there an opportunity for US-China cooperation, learning from each other, or anything else in terms of...
I'll be there at the end of the month. I mean, it's happening. One of the real, again, COP28, China came with a national methane strategy, which really is transformative, in part because they've committed to incorporating their methane abatement measures into their next version of their nationally determined contributions. So they are committed to actually incorporating methane into their next iteration of commitments under the Paris Agreement, and they're encouraging other countries in the world to do the same. So that's progress, and that's leadership.
So with that, I am going to draw this session to a close. First of all, thanks to all of you. Thanks to those of you who asked questions. I apologize to those of you who couldn't ask a question. Not all the panelists will run out immediately. So maybe you can still ask your questions. But thanks to everyone for your attention and participating with us. Please join me in thanking these stellar panelists.